140 years of pitchers and hitters and managers and stadiums and seasons and statistics and records and moments that define generations. 140 years of the greatest athletes the sport has ever produced, pushing the boundaries of what a human body can do inside the white lines of a baseball diamond. 140 years of legends, names carved into the permanent memory of the sport, performances that were described as unrepeatable, records that were declared untouchable, standards that were established as the permanent ceiling of human possibility within this game. 695%. That number, that single, almost incomprehensible figure, sits above all of it. Above every season, every performance, every record that 140 years of baseball history produced. It does not sit slightly above. It does not represent a modest improvement on what came before. It represents a gap so wide between what Shohei Ohtani has done and what anyone else in the history of the sport has ever done simultaneously as a pitcher and a hitter that the analysts who calculated it sat with the result for a long time before publishing it. Because numbers that large, in a sport obsessed with historical context and statistical comparison, do not arrive without consequence. They arrive with questions. With disbelief. With the particular kind of resistance that human beings apply to information that exceeds the boundaries of what they believed was possible. And then they arrive with the voices of the people who have seen everything this sport has to offer across decades of competing and watching and understanding baseball at its deepest level, the legends, the Hall of Famers, the men whose own careers represent the previous ceiling of greatness, saying something that none of them ever expected to say about any player in any era. He's completely the Jesus of baseball. Because 695% does not exist in isolation. It is not a statistic that emerges from a single game or a single season or a single dimension of performance. It is a composite, a measurement that attempts to do something that baseball's traditional statistical framework was never designed to do, because baseball's traditional statistical framework was never designed for a player like Ohtani. The sport has always evaluated pitchers and hitters separately. This is not an accident or an oversight. It is a reflection of the fundamental structure of the game, which has divided labor between pitching and hitting so completely and for so long that the idea of measuring both simultaneously, for the same player, in a way that captures his true combined contribution, simply never required serious attention. There was no player for whom it mattered. Until Ohtani. The metric that produced 695% was built specifically to address this gap. It attempts to quantify the combined value of a player's pitching performance and hitting performance against the historical baseline of what the very best players in baseball history produced in each discipline separately. It asks a simple question with a complicated answer. If you took the greatest hitting seasons in baseball history and compared them to what Ohtani produces with the bat, where does he rank? And if you took the greatest pitching seasons in baseball history and compared them to what Ohtani produces on the mound, where does he rank? And then, crucially, what happens when you combine both rankings into a single number that reflects the total value of everything he does? The answer is 695%. Not 695% better than the average player. Not 695% above replacement level in the modern analytical sense. 695% of the combined historical baseline, meaning that when you add up what Ohtani contributes as a pitcher and what he contributes as a hitter and measure that total against the historical standard of what the greatest players in each discipline produced individually, he exceeds that combined standard by a margin that has no precedent in over 140 years of recorded baseball history. The analysts who built this framework ran the numbers multiple times before releasing them. They checked their methodology. They stress-tested their assumptions. They looked for errors in the calculation that would bring the number back towards something more familiar, something that fit more comfortably within the historical context that baseball people use to orient themselves. The number held. Every time. 695%. This is the detail that matters most about the reactions that followed. Because the men whose voices carry the most weight in this conversation, the players who defined previous eras of the sport, who held the records that Ohtani is now lapping, who established the standards against which every generation of baseball talent has been measured, these men did not react immediately. They sat with it. A player who spent 20 years in the major leagues as one of the most complete hitters of his generation heard the number and did not speak for almost 30 seconds. When he finally did speak, the words came slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing language that fits something genuinely new. He said he had seen great players. He had played alongside great players. He had competed against great players in an era that produced multiple Hall of Famers and performances that the sport still references as benchmarks of excellence. He thought he understood the ceiling. He thought he had a framework, built across decades of experience, for where the outer limits of human performance in baseball were located. And then he watched Ohtani. Not highlights. Not clips. The full body of work, the pitching, the hitting, the preparation, the consistency across seasons that could not be explained by circumstance or favorable conditions or the ordinary variance that inflates statistics in limited samples. And he said what the number said. He said the ceiling he thought he understood was not actually the ceiling. It was simply the highest point that anyone had reached before Ohtani arrived to show everyone where the ceiling actually was. Then he said it. The comparison that no one expected and everyone immediately understood. He's completely the Jesus of baseball. Because it is not a comparison about religion. It is not a theological statement or a claim about divinity in the literal sense. The men who reached for this language, and it was not one voice, it was multiple voices, arriving at the same comparison independently, were reaching for it because no comparison that lives within the sport itself felt adequate to the scale of what they were describing. In baseball, you compare great players to other great players. You say someone hits like this legend or pitches like that icon. You place a new performance in the context of previous performances. You use the historical record as a reference point. This is how the sport talks about greatness, because the sport has enough history that the reference points are rich and varied and capable of capturing almost any kind of excellence. Almost any kind. What the legends encountered when they tried to place Ohtani within the historical framework of the sport was the same problem the metric encountered when it tried to calculate his value. The framework was not built for this. The reference points do not exist. There is no previous player whose combined pitching and hitting performance provides a meaningful comparison for what Ohtani is doing. The historical record, 140 years deep, simply does not contain anything close enough to be useful. So they reached outside the sport. They reached for the largest comparison available to them. The one that communicates, without qualification or asterisk, that what they are witnessing exists in a category of its own, a category that the sport's entire history of excellence did not produce before this moment. Jesus of baseball. Not because they are making a religious claim. Because they needed language large enough to hold the reality of 695%. Because when people think about Ohtani's statistical dominance, the pitching often receives primary attention, the strikeouts, the velocity, the movement profiles, the command. These are concrete and dramatic and easy to visualize. A hitter striking out against an elite pitch is a visible event with an obvious cause and effect. What Ohtani does with the bat is harder to visualize in the same way, but the numbers it produces are no less extraordinary. His power metrics place him among the most dangerous hitters in the sport. His exit velocities on contact are consistently among the highest recorded. His ability to cover the entire strike zone, to handle elite velocity and elite breaking balls with equal competence, to adjust his approach based on game situation and pitcher tendencies, these are hitting skills that exist at the very top of the game. But here is what the 695% figure captures that individual statistics miss. It captures the fact that these hitting numbers are being produced by the same person who is also producing those pitching numbers. In the same seasons. In the same games. With the same body that is absorbing the physical demands of elite starting pitching and still arriving at the plate ready to compete at the highest level as a hitter. The physical toll of what Ohtani does is something that baseball medicine and sports science have been studying with fascination since he first demonstrated that it was sustainable. Because the conventional wisdom of the sport, wisdom built across decades of watching pitchers try to hit and hitters try to pitch and seeing both attempts fail at the major league level, said that it was not sustainable. That the body could not absorb the demands of both disciplines simultaneously without one of them suffering. Ohtani did not simply prove that conventional wisdom wrong. He proved it wrong at a 695% level. This is the part that the legends emphasize when they move past the initial astonishment and arrive at genuine analysis. Because 695% does not fall from the sky. It does not arrive as a gift. It is not produced by talent alone, however extraordinary that talent might be. It is produced by a system of preparation that Ohtani has built and refined and protected across years of deliberate work, a system that is, in many ways, as unprecedented as the results it generates. The physical preparation is the visible part. The training regimens, the dietary discipline, the sleep protocols, the recovery systems that allow a body to perform elite pitching and elite hitting without breaking down under the combined load. These have been documented enough that the broad outlines are understood. Ohtani manages his body with a precision and a consistency that professionals in sports medicine describe as genuinely unusual, not just among baseball players but among elite athletes in any sport. But the mental preparation is what the legends keep returning to when they try to explain what separates him from the players who have attempted versions of the two-way path before and found it unsustainable. The mental preparation of switching between pitcher and hitter, of inhabiting the mental framework of someone whose job is to get hitters out and then, sometimes within the same game, inhabiting the mental framework of someone whose job is to get hits, requires a cognitive flexibility that very few athletes possess. The two roles require fundamentally different orientations toward the same game. A pitcher looks at a hitter and sees patterns to exploit and weaknesses to attack. A hitter looks at a pitcher and sees sequences to decode and locations to anticipate. Ohtani occupies both orientations simultaneously. He is always a pitcher who understands hitting and a hitter who understands pitching. And the result of that dual understanding is that he is better at both than any player who has only ever needed to understand one. This is what 695% actually measures. Not just the physical performance. The cognitive architecture that makes the physical performance possible. The sport has been patient. It has produced extraordinary players in every era, players who redefined positions, who broke records that seemed permanent, who performed at levels that their contemporaries described as impossible and their successors studied as inspiration. 140 years of that accumulation sits in the historical record, available for comparison, available for context. And the verdict that the metric returned, the 695% that sat above everything in that record, is not a commentary on the players who came before. It is not a diminishment of the legends who built the standards that the number measures against. Those players competed at the absolute limit of what their era demanded and their bodies allowed. Their greatness is real and permanent. What the number says is something different. It says that within the infinite possibility space of human performance in this sport, a space that 140 years of the greatest athletes in baseball history has been exploring, there was still a region that nobody had reached. A region so far beyond the explored territory that the distance between it and the previous boundary measures out at 695%. And Shohei Ohtani found it. Not by accident. Not by circumstance. Not by the favorable alignment of talent and opportunity that sometimes produces a great season that history eventually contextualizes into something more ordinary. By design. By preparation. By the same quiet, consistent, relentless commitment to a standard of excellence that he has maintained since long before anyone outside of Japan knew his name. The legends called him the Jesus of baseball. They reached for the largest comparison they had. And looking at 695% across 140 years of history, it is genuinely difficult to argue that they reached too far.